morning and welcome. I'm Greg Brown, Executive Director of the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan business policy think tank affiliated with UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School. So the Kenan Institute has committed to conducting a deep dive investigation this year on a topic of substantial interest to global business and policymakers, and that's stakeholder capitalism and sort of its relevant ESG investing application, I guess. Joining us today is London Business School finance professor Alex Edmans. He's an authority on corporate social responsibility and the idea that companies which are attentive to their employees' well-being produce superior long-run stock returns. We're honored to have him as a 2022 Kenan Institute Distinguished Fellow. During this fellowship, Professor Edmans will work with us as we develop actionable insights for business leaders and policymakers. We're excited to have his contributions into our work, including those from his recent book entitled Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, which was named in the Financial Times as part of the Financial Times Business Book of the Year for 2020. He's also been named Poets and Quants MBA Professor of the Year for 2021. He's managing editor of one of the top journals in finance, the Review of Finance. So we'll hear from Professor Edmans directly before opening things up for Q&A during the second half of today's conversation. But please know that you can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. But at this time, I'm pleased to turn things over to my colleague and friend, Professor Alex Edmans. Alex?
Thank you so much, Greg. It's great to be here and give this webinar, and also more generally to be engaged with the Institute as a fellow for 2022. So what I'm going to talk about today is the power of purposeful business. So we often think about purpose and we think about the moral and ethical reasons for why a company should serve wider society. And absolutely, morals and ethics are really important. But unless there's a business and financial case, purpose might always be secondary in the minds of some CEOs and some investors. So what I want to focus here is, as a professor of finance and as an investment banker in my prior life, is there actually a financial case for purpose which we can use to supplement the already compelling moral and ethical case? And so I'm going to start by a story, or taking you on a little bit of a journey to give you a view of what I mean by purpose. And this is actually quite a different view to what you typically hear. So I'm going to take you away from your home offices to halfway around the world. I'm going to take you to the Great Rift Valley. So this stretches across 2 continents and 6,000 kilometers from Lebanon and Asia to Mozambique in Africa. And it has some of the world's highest mountains, like this one, but also some of the world's deepest lakes. And one of these lakes is a lake called Lake Nagadi, which is in the Kenyan stretch of the Great Rift Valley. Now, fewer than 1,000 people live around this lake, and one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Soronga, and he makes a living selling and herding goats. Now, for Emmanuel, it used to be that cash was king. When he sold a goat, he'd receive cash, and he'd then have to check that cash in case it was forged. He'd have to store that cash and worry about it being stolen. And then to bank that cash, he had to trek for an entire day to get to the nearest bank. So his life was really tough. He couldn't graze his goats in the greenest pastures. He always had to be within 1 day of a bank. But all of that changed due to a purposeful business. And this business was Vodafone, the UK telecoms giant. Because in 2007, Vodafone launched M-Pesa, which is a mobile money service in Kenya. So let me briefly explain what mobile money is, because some of us think it's mobile banking. Well, I used to live in the US. I have a Bank of America account, but I can operate it on my phone. I don't need to go down to the branch, which is great because I'm now in the UK. But that's not what mobile money is. For mobile money, you don't even need a bank account to begin with. You can transfer your money on your phone even without having an account. And that was really powerful because at the time, 15 million Kenyan adults were unbanked. So that has transformed Emmanuel's life. He doesn't need to worry about cash anymore. He doesn't need to deal with robbery or forgery. He can graze his goats where he wants to. But as academics, we know that we don't just want to base something on one single story. we want to look at large-scale research. And indeed, there was an influential paper from some MIT professors finding that within the first 7 years of launching M-Pesa, 200,000 households got lifted out of poverty, and many of these households were headed up by women. It allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail, so there was a large effect on gender equality. So that's one story I'm going to tell you about Vodafone, but I'm now going to tell you a quite different story. And this different story surrounds tax. Because in 2012, Vodafone became the first telecoms company around the world to release a tax transparency report showing how much tax they were paying to governments worldwide. And fair tax is a really important issue in telecoms because you could choose to locate your intellectual property in low tax jurisdictions. So I've got two questions for everybody here to think about. First is, which of these decisions, launching M-Pesa or releasing that tax transparency report, created most value for society? And the second is, which of these decisions, if it had not been taken, would have led to the most public anger or worsened Vodafone's ESG rating or reputation? Now, I'm not going to poll anybody here because, as Greg said, we'll have a lot of time at the end for Q&A. And the reason for not polling anybody is that most people agree with the answers. So which decision created most value for society? It was the first one. By launching M-Pesa, Vodafone lifted 200,000 households out of poverty and contributed to gender equality. But if we turn to the second question, what would have been the outrage from not launching M-Pesa? It would have been nothing, right? There would have been no public boycott. Nobody would have ever thought it was even possible to come up with this crazy idea of banking without a bank. And there would be no shaming in the newspaper because, again, this was something that would not have been expected. But what would have been the outrage for not being transparent on tax? It could be massive. And indeed, Vodafone had suffered a nationwide boycott of their stores 2 years previously. So this is why my view of purpose might be somewhat different to what you typically hear. People typically think about purpose as being the answer to that second question. Purposeful businesses should do no harm. They should not cheat on taxes. They should not pollute the environment. They should not mistreat their workers. And absolutely, that is part of a purposeful business. A purposeful business should not do those things. But purpose needs to be more than just that. Why? First is the moral and ethical case. Right, given the challenges that the world faces in 2022, I don't think it's enough for a company just to say, I'm not mistreating my workers, I'm not having some bad scandals. I think a company needs to actively do good and actively solve some of the problems of the world rather than just not enhancing them. But as I mentioned at the start of my talk, I'm going to focus this talk much more on the business and financial case. Now, often people think, well, the business and financial case for purpose is to avoid a scandal. Purpose is about good risk management. We don't want to be a Wells Fargo who engages in fake bank account creation. But if that is the case, right, purpose is something that we should just do the minimum possible to avoid a scandal. There is no need to go above and beyond. What I would like to stress is how purpose is about the answer to the first question. It's about actively creating value, doing things that you never needed to do, like creating M-Pesa. But you do them anyway because it's good for society. But also fundamentally, it is good for business. And to highlight that business and financial case, let me show you a little bit of the framework that I developed in my book, Grow the Pie, that Greg kindly mentioned. So we often think that the value that a company creates is given by a pie, and that pie can be split between investors in the form of profit and society in the form of taxes to the government and wages to workers and fair prices to customers. And we often think that purpose is about splitting the pie more fairly. Let's give a lot of profits to charity. Let's pay workers more than we can get away with. And again, don't get me wrong, part of purpose is indeed equality, but purpose must be more than that for two reasons. The first is if that purpose is about splitting the pie, then no CEO would really want to do it because it makes her company less profitable. Indeed, 2.5 years ago, we saw 181 CEOs in the US sign this Business Roundtable statement claiming they're going to serve wider society. But when the rubber hit the road, many of them didn't really put it into practice. And why would they? Why would you do something that makes your company less profitable? You should just sign a nice statement and then never do anything about it. And the second reason why purpose can't be just about pie splitting is that it's bad for investors. Now, many people think, I don't care. They like to see investors as nameless, faceless capitalists. Investors are them, society is us, and if we can take from them and give to us, then the world is better off. But I need to tell this audience that investors are not them, they are us. They include parents saving for their children's education, pension funds investing for retirement, university endowments investing to fund future teaching and research. So any repurposing of business absolutely needs to take investors seriously. Profits are a key role of a well-functioning economy. So this is why I view purpose as being about growing the pie. So we absolutely do need to increase the orange, but the way we do that is not by giving a greater slice of what's already there, but through innovation, through excellence, through actively creating value, coming up with some crazy ideas like banking without a bank. Because the beauty of viewing purpose as value creation is that even though Vodafone genuinely wanted to create social value, not financial value, they genuinely just wanted to solve the problem of financial inclusion in Kenya. After they did that, they found a way to monetize it. And that's why investors became better off as well. The blue increased. So at this point in my talk, you might think, well, everything I've said sounds great, but where's the evidence? It sounds a bit like wishful thinking. But I'm saying companies should just think about creating value for society and magically some profits will appear, but that almost seems too good to be true. Right, yes, I've told you the story of Vodafone, but how do you know that I didn't just handpick this one story? It might be that's the exception, not the rule. So that's why it's great to work with UNC on this, and just not for this talk, but more generally the Kenan Institute across the whole year, to look at the rigorous large-scale research and to go beyond just stories and case studies. When we look at hundreds of companies across dozens of industries over multiple years, is it indeed true that purposeful companies can perform better? And the important thing here is to stress the criticality of research being rigorous. And this is because of the idea of confirmation bias. That is, when you would just like to accept evidence if it confirms what we would like to be true. And that's a particular problem in a responsible business, right? We would love to believe that purposeful companies always perform better. So if there was a study claiming that, we might latch onto it uncritically, even if the evidence is quite weak. And I gave a TED talk a couple of years ago, what to trust in a post-truth world, about just how careful we need to be when it's on a topic where we have quite strong feelings. And just to give you an example of that, let me go through a recent study done by the UK regulator, the Financial Reporting Council, on diversity. Now, that's something that I, and I'm sure everybody on this webinar, really cares strongly about, right? Me as an ethnic minority myself, but also caring about gender diversity and many other forms of diversity. Now, this regulator released a report claiming that the more the diversity in the boardroom, the greater the financial performance, and they chose the measure of financial performance being EBITDA margin. But then when I looked at the actual study itself and the results for EBITDA margin, what I found is that out of the 90 regressions they ran, not a single one was significant. So in the executive summary, they claimed to have found these results, and indeed everybody took this at face value. There were so many headlines about the study, but if you just took a moment to look at the tables, nothing was significant. And the big embarrassment for me was that this study was not done by the Financial Reporting Council. They published it, but it was done by my own institution, London Business School. And the Dean of London Business School said at the start, This academic rigor yields new insights we all stand to learn from the author's methodology and findings. So for me, I obviously would love a London Business School study on a topic that I really care about, diversity, to show the positive results, but I need to step away from my own personal bias towards my employer and also my bias towards diversity, and to look dispassionately at the data. And unfortunately, in the study, the data did not match the claim. So what I want to look at now is, what does careful research say about whether purpose pays off? And this is something that I looked at myself about 15 years ago. So one of the big challenges for anything about purpose is, well, how do we measure it? Now, you might think, can we just look at a company's purpose statement and see which companies have the best purpose statements? We might be doing some textual analysis. But that's problematic, because some companies might say some great things, but not actually put them into practice. So you might think, well, don't we just look at which companies put the money where their mouth is? Right, how much do companies donate to charity? How much do they pay their workers? But that measures the input, not the output. Right, so you could just spend loads of money on charity, but you might not give to the right charity. And anyone here who's a sports fan will know that actually the teams that spend the most on players might not be delivering the best results. And on the flip side, there might be some companies who do some great things for society. If you have a great boss at work who gives you meaningful work and skills development and mentorship, that doesn't cost her anything, but it makes a big difference to you. So what I wanted to look at is not what companies say, not even how much they spend, but how much value they create for society. And so what I looked at was the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America, which is how well a company treats its workers. And notice this looks at the active value creation, how these companies go right into the above and beyond. It's not just avoiding scandals, avoiding strikes and so on, but going above and beyond and making your company a great place to work. So why was that my measure of purpose? Right? Why don't I look at the environment or government taxes or something? It's because this is something which matters in every industry. In virtually every company, employees are critical. Now, climate change is absolutely a really important threat, but it matters much more in, let's say, energy than tech. So I wanted to look at something which was important for all industries. And the other reason why I looked at this is that I had tons of data, because this data started in 1984. Now, purpose is a pretty new phenomenon, and so many data sources have only been around, let's say, since 2010. And if I showed you that companies that were purposeful did well between 2010 and 2019, you might think, well, those were 10 great years for the stock market. Maybe purpose only does well in an upswing. Maybe in a pandemic or when there's a war, we should just focus on the bottom line and not be distracted by purpose. But because my data started in 1984, I had things like the financial crisis, like September the 11th and the collapse of the internet bubble, so I could make sure that this was something that does well in bad times as well as good. So what was the bottom line? I found that these 100 best companies to work for in America delivered shareholder returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% cumulative. So step back from the numbers, what does that mean? Like, companies that are treating their workers well, they are being moral and ethical, but they're being more than that. They're being financially and commercially astute. They're investing in their biggest asset. They're not just giving them parts of the pie. By treating their workers well, they're more motivated and more productive. They're growing the pie, and shareholders are being better off as a result. Now, at the start, I mentioned the importance of being very careful with evidence and not just latching onto conclusions we like. So you look at this correlation, but you might think, well, could there be some other alternative explanations for this? Maybe there's what we call in finance omitted variables. Maybe in the tech industry, people are happy, and the tech industry happens to have done well. So when I talk about the peers, I have to control for what industry you're in, the size of the company, recent performance, valuation ratios, and a whole host of other factors. But then there's another problem. You might think, well, what about unobservable variables that you can't control for? Let's say a company has a great CEO, and that great CEO treats her employees well, and that great CEO leads to good performance anyway. So what I have to do is to do something different, and this is a different technique. What I looked at was analyst expectations. So every 3 months in the US, as you know, companies will announce their earnings. And before they do that, the likes of Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley, my former firm, will predict the earnings. And when they do so, right, they will take management quality into account. What analysts claim is they spend all their time talking to management, and so their analyst forecast should incorporate how good the manager is. But what I found was that these best companies were systematically doing better than what analysts were expecting. So there must be something beyond just management quality and other things that analysts take into account, which was driving the higher return. Now, even if you believe everything I've just shown you, and even if you believe the validity of the study, you might still be skeptical, because you might think, does this show anything about purpose? Yes, companies that treat their workers better do better, but isn't it sufficient for a company just to think about profit? Maybe all a company needs to do is to try and think, how do I make as much money as possible? And even if your only goal is profit, you will still invest in your workers, because you know, happier workers make for more productive workers, and I'm going to make more money. Indeed, let's think about, say, building an electric car factory. Now, some people might build an electric car factory because they care about climate change. But what if you only cared about money? You would still build the electric car factory. Like, you would do the net present value analysis we teach you, and you're going to forecast, yeah, the net present value of this car factory is huge. Why? Because the demand for electric cars is going to be really, really high. So in fact, we don't even need to care about purpose. All we need to do is to think about long-term profit, and it's going to cause you to make all of these positive decisions. But actually, I disagree with this. Why? Because that approach of net present value, that assumes that you can replace and reduce every decision to a financial calculation. Yes, you can do that with electric cars. You can put that into a spreadsheet, and yes, the world is uncertain, but we know how to deal with uncertainty. You can just do a sensitivity analysis by changing the selling price of electric cars. But how could you do a net present value calculation on something like M-Pesa? Like, what is the profit from launching mobile money? It was probably not even going to work to begin with. The tech challenges were huge. Nobody had ever developed anything like mobile money before. And even if you could pull it off, where was the profit to be made from serving some of the poorest people in the world? At the time, Vodafone's strategy was to win spectrum license auctions in the West, because that's where the market was the strongest. So this is why I think purpose is so powerful. This is why I think purpose has such a strong business case, because what it does is it frees us from having to justify every decision with a financial calculation. It instead allows us to do things just because it's good business and good for society. It allows us to justify things like M-Pesa. Now, ultimately, they might become successful in the long term, and they might ultimately lead to the company becoming profitable. But you could have never predicted the profit from the outset. Why? Because it's hard to forecast more than a few years out. And also, often, profits come from sources that you never expected. So where is the evidence that actually profits might be unexpected? Well, Caroline Flammer, she's a strategy professor now at Columbia. And what she did is she gathered shareholder proposals to make a company more responsible. So that's when shareholders go to a company's annual general meeting and they'll ask it to implement a climate change policy or an anti-discrimination policy. And she uses a technique called regression discontinuity to find that after these proposals are passed, sales go up, profits go up, and the stock price go up. So that's striking, right? Because even though those proposals aimed to create value for society, they also created profits because by serving society better, this grew the pie and the company became more financially successful. But here's the even more powerful point. Right, these proposals should not have been needed if the profit mindset is enough. Right, any CEO should know that anti-discrimination is good for profits because it will improve employee morale. So they should have put these policies into place anyway. But they didn't. It took the diverse perspectives of outside shareholders one step removed from the day-to-day focus on profits to open up the eyes of these CEOs and make them put these policies into place. So the final part of my talk is, well, how do we put purpose into practice, right? We've said it's important. We've said there's a business case behind it, more than just long-term profit. But then how does a company become purposeful? And the important question is to ask, well, what does it mean to be purposeful? Nowadays, everybody's talking about purpose. From the CEO of BlackRock, the largest investor in the world, to Princeton, a puppet in Avenue Q, he talks about finding his purpose. But everybody talks about purpose without ever defining what it means. So how I define purpose is as the following. It's why a company exists, who it serves, its reason for being, and the role that it plays in the world. Now, that might sound pretty lofty and pretty idealistic, so let me focus on picking it apart. Why you exist, who you serve, your reason for being, and the role that you play, they all need to be targeted and focused. Right? So we often think about purpose as being about altruism. A purposeful company is one that serves wider society. A purposeful person is one who doesn't think about themselves, they think about everybody else. But if you think about it, what does the word purpose mean in the English language? It means being focused and targeted. Right? A purposeful meeting is one with a clear agenda. If I do something on purpose, I do it deliberately. So why you exist, who you serve, your reason for being, and the role you play, they all need to be specific. But then you might think, well, how do we decide what to focus on? The question I think that every company should ask themselves is, what is in my hand? What are the resources and what is the expertise that my company has, and how can I use this to serve wider society if I just think a little bit more creative? So Vodafone realized that it could take its expertise in transferring text messages and use that expertise to transfer money instead. And so that's why they chose to solve financial inclusion rather than one of the world's many other challenges. But the United Nations has 17 sustainable development goals. But it's not a company's responsibility to solve every single one of the world's problems, but to focus on the 3 or 4 where it can really move the needle. And the power of seeing purpose as using what's in your hand is that it allows all companies to play their part, regardless of how large or small they are. So we often think about purpose as splitting the pie differently, donating millions to charity or giving free products. And that's great, but only some companies can do that. Indeed, what we saw in the coronavirus pandemic was some heroic activities by some companies. Unilever donated 150 million euros of food and sanitizer to local communities. They gave up part of the pie to help others. Now that's inspiring, but it's also intimidating, because what if you're a small company? You don't have 150 million euros lying around. You don't have pie that you can give. So how can you help out in a crisis? By asking yourself, what's in your hand? What can I do to grow the pie? Because that's something that you don't need money to do. All you need is this purpose and this mindset shift. So what we saw in the pandemic was companies in completely unrelated industries and small companies play their part. So let me give you an example of an unrelated company and also a small company that I'm a customer of. It's called Barry's Bootcamp. So this is a brutal chain of gyms in London, and these gyms that are around the US in many, many states. It started off in California. Now, these gyms were shut during the pandemic because obviously of the lockdown. But what is in their hand is fitness expertise. And they use that to offer free Instagram fitness classes, which made a huge difference when everybody is self-isolating at home. Now you might think, well, a fitness company doesn't need a purpose to think about offering free fitness classes. Isn't this kind of obvious? But what's really interesting is what the Barry's desk workers did. So these were the reception desk workers when you check yourself in at the gym. Now the gym was shut, so what did these desk workers do? Well, it turns out that many of these desk workers are actors as their main job. And if you're an actor, your income is pretty volatile, so that's why they took this desk job to provide themselves with income stability. And if you're a desker, what is in your hand? You're really entertaining. Well, how does that help out? Well, what we had in the pandemic was schools were shut because children were at home. So what Barry's offered was free Zoom storytelling sessions and other online entertainment to take the load off their working parents, so when their parents had an important call, then their kids could do these Barry Zoom storytelling sessions, and this made a huge difference. And also the power of what's in my hand is not only does it allow all companies to play their part, large and small, but it allows all people to play their part. But so far in this talk, I've always talked about purposeful companies. But companies don't make decisions, people make decisions. Now, if purpose involves spending money, donating millions to charity, then only the CEO can make the decision. But if purpose involves using what's in your hand, that's something that every employee can do, no matter how senior you are. And importantly, you can also do that no matter how purposeful your company currently is. So as I alluded to earlier, my first job was at Morgan Stanley in investment banking, right, which is a pretty cutthroat industry, not often one that's associated with purpose. And I started off right at the bottom in a position called analyst. And I thought I had nothing in my hand. Right? Nobody worked for me. I worked for the associate, and he worked for the vice president, who worked for the executive director, and so on. But I actually realized I did have something in my hand because some people did work for me. My secretary worked for me. So did the IT department, and perhaps the most abused department in an investment bank is the graphics department. So you typically give them some unintelligible scribble, and they turn that into some beautiful PowerPoint slides. Now, analysts would often shout at graphics for not doing what they wanted, even though it was often your fault for not explaining it clearly enough. So there was many occasions when graphics did a good job. And so I would call them up and I'd say, hi, this is Alex. Can you put me through to whoever did my job? And I'd say, well, this was a great job. Right? All these three things I asked for, you did it well. And this fourth thing I didn't even ask for, but you did it anyway. Now, sincerely, I didn't say thank you to just be seen as a nice person, to be seen as a goody-goody. I just said it because I thought it was the right thing to do. But because I was so junior, because I was right at the bottom of the bank, I didn't have my own office. I sat in what they call the bullpen, this open plan floor where all the junior analysts and the secretaries sit. Because I didn't have my own office, when I would say thank you, the other analysts started to hear me, and then they decided to start saying thank you themselves. Now, I'm not going to claim that we transformed the entire culture of this global investment bank. Clearly, we didn't. But perhaps on that 7th floor of those offices in Canary Wharf, London, people started treating each other a little bit more kindly. What was in our hand was not rank or status, it was just our words, but that was something which still made a little bit of a difference. So we often think about ourselves as a thermometer, right? So a thermometer is something which reflects the temperature around you. So if the atmosphere around you is cutthroat, then you might think, well, I need to be cutthroat myself to survive, which is also what we often think about in an investment bank. But what this suggests is that everybody, from CEO to analyst, has the power to play thermostat and to affect the temperature around. So before I hand back to Greg for the Q&A, let's just sum up, well, why I think purpose is so powerful. Right, for so many years, finance professors, and including me, I'm going to blame myself, what we've said is we should make decisions based on financial forecasts. And that works for many decisions. I'm not going to throw the baby out of the bathwater. Any decision where you can project the future with some degree of certainty, you should use net present value. And if there is uncertainty, there are ways of dealing with the uncertainty. You can do something like a sensitivity analysis. But what about some decisions which are truly intangible, where it's impossible to even begin to think about a midpoint forecast of cash flows. Let's say we're a company, we're thinking about giving more parental leave to our employees. Yes, we have some sense that the employees will become more motivated and more likely to stay, but how can we turn that into a cash flow? There is no way we can think about it. If Unilever thinks about what's the payoff from donating the food and sanitizer, yes, they have some sense they're going to build their reputation, but it's again very difficult to translate that into a cash flow. And the same with the other examples of Vodafone and M-Pesa, or even Barry's and this Zoom storytelling sessions. But the power of purpose is that it allows us to do things for intrinsic, non-instrumental reasons, because it's the right thing to do, and often afterwards, profits will follow. Now, this does not unlock us and does not give us a license to do anything we want to and think that anything that we do to serve society will ultimately benefit us. But what I've highlighted is the idea of what's in our hand, the idea of using our comparative advantage, our expertise, our resources, and if what we do to serve society is absolutely linked to our expertise, that's something where it won't cost us a huge amount to create, and therefore it's even more likely that actually, even if we're doing it to serve wider society, ultimately the pie will grow and ultimately profits will also increase, even though those higher profits were never the reason for that social value creation to begin.